Good morning, guys. It's currently 6 a.m. in the morning and I am at the trailhead for Mont Megantic. So this is going to be my first hike in Quebec. It's supposed to be maybe like a 2,000 to 3,000 feet in elevation gain. And I think it's like a 5-hour round trip hike. As you can imagine, the views on this trail should be pretty amazing. So yeah, really looking forward to this hike. Right, so just going to crack on with this hike and I'll keep you updated. Right, so it's now been almost an hour into the hike. So this is a round trip hike. So you can obviously go clockwise or anti-clockwise. So I've decided to go anti-clockwise as per the All Trails route, which means doing the most difficult part first, which doesn't seem like a bad idea. If I remember correctly, there's Mont St. Joseph. There's also the extension point. I think there may be one or two after that before we then get to the summit of Mont Megantic. So yeah, the worst of it's over now. So it should be a bit more flat. Hopefully we'll start seeing some viewpoints. Right, so it's now been 2.5 hours into the hike. The last significant viewing point was the Pic de Crespolsculs. I'm sure I'm not pronouncing that correctly. I think we're probably about an hour away now from Mont Megantic. Right guys, it's now been 3.5 hours into the hike. Mont Megantic Peak should be just behind me near that dome. It's starting to get a lot warmer now, but we're almost there. Right, just gonna go find the summit. After almost 4 hours of hiking, finally arrived at the peak, or the summit, of 1,110 meters, I think. The main viewing point is where I am right now, and it's just next to the Mont Megantic Observatory. Right, so this session that I want to talk through in today's video actually happened on Sunday last week, which was also the day where they ran this promotion of the Millionaire Maker. So I arrived at the casino in time for the 11 a.m. draw. We sat down at the second 2-5 table, I think that was open. We start with the max, which is 1K as per usual, and we dive into our first interesting hand of the session. Right, so in this first interesting hand of the session, the action folds all the way to me in the hijack, and I look down at Jack 8 of spades. So I decide to make the standard open to $15. The action then continues folding all the way to the big blind, who, after looking at his cards, decides to defend his big blind with a call. So we are now going heads up to the flop. And on the flop, the dealer puts out Jack 5-3 with 2 hearts. So we flop ourselves with top pair with a pretty weak kicker. The big blind decides to start the check, and the action is now on me. And I think with a hand like Jack 8 of spades on this flop texture, it's not going to be a hand that we are very likely going to be triple barreling here for value. This is quite a dynamic board, and we have quite a vulnerable hand here. And I think something else which is quite important to note here is that we have quite a poor kicker to go along with our jack, which I think for me places it firmly in the basket of going for a maximum of 2 streets of value. I think this is a really good hand to put into my checkmate range for 2 reasons. The first reason is for pot control, and the second reason is to balance the times when I flop complete air. With all this in mind, I decide to check back. So we are now off to a free turn card, and on the turn, the dealer puts out the 7 of spades. Villain in the big blind now decides to lead out for $20. We have a pretty clear decision here, especially given that we check back the flop. So on the flop, our hand was kind of like a middling strength type hand. Given that we check back the flop, our hand now actually improves in relative strength on the turn. One could argue some merits for actually raising the turn here to then check back river, but I also think calling is pretty good, and I think in my view is probably the more standard play here. Given that I check back the flop, villain can have a bunch of worse 1-pair type hands here, which we'd want to be betting for protection / value. After weighing up the merits between raising and calling, I decide to continue with a flat call. So we are now off to a river card, and on the river, the dealer puts out the 10 of spades. Very curious now to see what villain decides to do. I think if villain decides to put in like a large bet or even like an over bet, that would then put our hand in a really, really tough spot. But fortunately for me, villain decides to check river. So the action's now back on me, and given the way the hand has played out, I think we have a crystal clear value bet. In this spot, we want to go for a medium kind of size bet here for value. For that reason, I decide to put out a bet of $50. Villain then doesn't take too long before making the call. I then show my hand, and then villain mucks his cards. So we get to drag in a nice little pot here to start the session. In this hand, the $10 straddle is on, and the action folds all the way to me in the big blind, and I look down at King 5 offsuit. So I decide to make the call, and the player in the straddle checks his option. So we are now going heads up to the flop, and the flop comes 5-3 deuce rainbow. In this spot, we should pretty much always have the best hand here, and I think this hand should always be betting here, as there are a lot of worse hands that can continue, like worse one pair type hands, or even like a top pair with like a worse kicker, and our hand could also benefit for some protection from some of his random 2 overcards to the board. So I decide to put out a min bet of $10. Villain in the straddle decides to make the call. So we are now off to see a turn card. On the turn, the dealer puts out the Queen of Diamonds. So all in all, this should pretty much be a brick turn card. Action's on me, and I think on this turn card, given it should never really change anything, if we were good on the flop, then we should still be good on the turn. So I decide to size up to $30. Villain in the straddle then doesn't think for too long before continuing for another call. So we are now off to see a river card. And on the river, the dealer puts out an offsuit king. So we now improve to kings up. In this spot, we are very, very confident that we have the best hand here. So we are going to go for 3 streets of value. To be fair, I think even if the river wasn't a king and it was like another brick, maybe like a queen or maybe like a jack, I think we still would be continuing to go for some value. But given that we now have improved to kings up, given that we do have a bunch of bluffs which arrive at the river as played, namely our 4x or maybe like our 6-7s, I think these hands want to go for a large sizing. And so what we should be doing in this spot is to be mixing in our strongest hands which arrive at this river to balance out the times when we have complete air. So given that we arrive at the river with a bunch of air and also some kings up as we do in this case, I think we need to be going for quite a large sizing here. So I decide to put out a large bet of $115. Villain now goes into the tank, and after thinking it through, he eventually decides to make the call. So I table my hand, and of course it's good, and villain then quietly mucks his cards. So yeah, we get to drag in quite a decent pot here in a somewhat of a blind versus straddle situation. In this next hand, the $10 straddle is on again. The action falls all the way to the cutoff, who is a short stack, and he decides to limp in for $10. I am then next act on the button, and I look down at ace jack of clubs. So I decide to put in a raise to $40. The action then folds all the way to the straddle, who decides to make the call, and then the cutoff, who starts the hand with only like $140, $150, surprisingly makes the fold. So we now heads up to the flop, which comes ace 7-3 with 1 club. Action checks to me, and in this spot, I think we have a pretty standard C bet here. So I decide to put out a bet of $30. Villain in the straddle then doesn't think for too long before making the call. So we're now off to see a turn card, and the dealer puts out the 10 of clubs. So we now add the backdoor nut flush draw to go along with our top pair. Action checks to me, and of course we want to continue betting here given our hand has now improved. In terms of sizings, I think like a medium-sized bet probably makes the most sense to me given our hand strength and given villain's range in the straddle. So I decided to put out a double barrel of $75. The villain in the straddle then doesn't take too long before making the call. So we are now off to see a river card, and on the river the dealer puts out the deuce of clubs. So we now river the nuts. Villain now takes a pause at this river card, and he goes into the tank, and after a short while he decides to lead out. He decides to grab a fistful of his $25 chips and he chucks it into the pot. The dealer then counts it out and confirms that he put out a bet of $175. Now when I see this lead out, I think that villain never has a bluff in the spot, and he always has a really strong hand. And I think for that reason, I think if we did put in a raise here, there's probably a good chance that we're going to get called here. In terms of sizings, I mean, villain has like $600 or $700 in the stack. So I think given the bet sizing that he's chosen, I think there's only one size that makes sense here, especially given that we have the nuts. So I decide to put villain all in, and then villain, sure enough, snap calls. So I table my hand and villain sees the bad news, and moreover, I get to see what villain had because he showed me that he had 6-3 of clubs for a backdoor flush. Pretty sick cooler for him, and fortunate for us to win his stack. Moving on to the next interesting hand. In this hand, the action folds to me in the hijack, and I look down at Jack 8 of diamonds. So I decide to open up to $15. The cutoff on my direct left then decides to make the call before the action then continues folding all the way to the big blind, who also decides to call. So we are now going 3 ways to the flop, which comes ace, jack 3 with 2 diamonds. So we flop ourselves a pair and a flush draw. Action checks to me, and I think in this spot with this hand, we want to be c-betting at quite a high frequency. So I decide to put out a c-bet of $20. The cutoff calls, and the big blind also decides to call. So we are now off to see a turn card, and on the turn, the dealer puts out the jack of spades. So we now improve to trips. The big blind checks, and the action is now on me. And in this spot, we are going to be putting in double barrel here. I think the question here is just on sizing. We need to think about the types of hands that we are targeting. And in this spot, I think the most obvious candidate here would be an ace-x. So I think these types of hands are not very likely going to be able to call pot size or overbets. Probably make the most sense to be overbetting jack-x hands with like a strong kicker, like a king or maybe a queen at least. Because in that case, I think we can go for an overbet, because I would fully expect to be called by jack-x hands with worse kickers. So with all of this in mind, I decide to go for another small medium size type bet, and I decide to put out a bet of $60. The cutoff now folds, and the big blind now goes into the tank before eventually settling on a call. So we're now off to see a river card here, and on the river, the dealer puts out the 4 of spades. The big blind now decides to check for a third time, and in this spot, we are obviously going to go for a third street of value. And I think the exact hand which we are targeting here is just an ace-x hand. I think that's the only hand that can really call us on this river card. Looking at the size of the pot, I decide to put out another medium type size bet of $125. Villain now goes deep into the tank, and I think given that he's not stat folded, just means that he doesn't have a flush draw and he does have an ace, and he's just trying to decide whether or not to pay us off. And after a little while, villain eventually decides to make the good fold. Maybe we should have bet a little bit smaller on the river card here to increase the chances of us being able to get called, but nonetheless, we are going to be dragging in this pot. Right, so in this next hand, we see a limp from under the gun to $5. The action then folds all the way to me on the button, and I look down at pocket aces. So I decide to bump it up to $25. The action then folds back to the under the gun limper, who decides to make the call. So we are now going heads up to the flop, and the flop comes 7-5 deuce with 2 spades, and I don't think we have the ace of spades in our hand. The player under the gun decides to start with the check, and the action is now on me. And I think in this spot, I like mixing in some strong overpairs here as a check back, and I think there's 2 good reasons for doing so. I think the first reason is we can pot control, especially given that we don't have the ace of spades and we could be beat. I think the second reason would be that I think more likely than not, villain could have like 2 random kind of overcards, like a 10-9 suited or queen-jack suited or like king-queen. And I think by checking, we can give ourselves the opportunity to extract some more value if villain hits on the turn. So with all of this in mind, I decide that the more profitable or better line to take would be to check back. So we are now off to see a free turn card, and on the turn, the dealer puts out the queen of diamonds. Villain now decides to go into the tank before putting out a bet of $25. Seems like our plan is working here. So in this part, I think we can obviously mix between raising and calling. I think I lean more towards calling here just to disguise the strength of our hand. For that reason, I decide to continue with a flat call. So we're now off to see a river card, and on the river, the dealer puts out the King of Diamonds. Villain now decides to check on this river card, so the action is now on me. Of course, we need to be going for some value here. The only hand that we're really afraid of here is King Queen. But besides that, I think we should pretty much always have the best hand here. In terms of sizings, I think we want to be choosing like a medium type size bet here. As if Villain did have a Queen X hand, then he's not going to be too comfortable calling large bets given that the King has peeled off on the river. So I decide to put in a bet of $60. Villain then goes into the tank before then deciding to make the call, which is obviously great news for us. So we table our hand, and Villain sees our hand, taps the table, says nice hand, and we get to drag in this small pot.
Chico and Mom for your 1-3 table change. Chico and Mom, Shabata.
Right, in this next hand, we see an open from early position to $15. The action then quickly folds all the way to me in the big blind, and I look down at ace-4 offsuit. So pretty standard defend here. I decide to continue with a flat call. So we are now heads up to the flop, and on the flop, the dealer puts out deuce 5-7 rainbow. So we flop ourselves a gut shot and an overcard. I decide to start with a check, and Villain decides to continue for a C bet of $20. I think I lean more towards just flatting here rather than raising. I think if Villain had decided to put out like a bet of $10 or $15, I would increase the frequency at which I would be check raising here. But given this sizing, which feels a lot more like value to me, I feel more comfortable just continuing with a flat call. We are now off to see a turn card. And on the turn, the dealer puts out the ace of spades. So we now improve to top pair. I decide to check twice, and now Villain decides to go into the tank before putting in a second barrel, although he decides to downsize a bit to $25. Given the relatively small bet size, I feel like he could still be making these kind of bets with overpairs to the flop. I don't think we need to be raising here. I think we just call turn and then reevaluate and play river cards. So I decide to continue with a call. So we're now off to see a river card, and on the river, the dealer puts out the 4 of spades. So we now improve to aces up. I decide to check for a third time here to see what Villain decides to do, and Villain now decides to put out another bet. But now he decides to size up to $100. When I see this size up, I really don't feel like my hand is good too often. I think this betting pattern of like betting flop and then sizing down on the turn to then size up on the river is very unlikely to be a bluff. I suppose you could have ace 5, you could have ace 3 would probably make a lot of sense. I don't really see what much else value Villain could have here. And in terms of bluffs, I struggle to see many bluffs. And given that we are pretty close to the top of our range here, I think I need to look them up here once in a while. So on this case, this was one of those occasions, and I decided to flick in the call, and Villain tabled pocket deuces for a flopped set. Really sucked in terms of the run out. It was pretty much the perfect run out for him to get paid on. And yeah, nice hand. Right, so now we come on to the final and what I think was probably the most interesting hand from my session last week. In this hand, the $10 straddle is on, and the action falls to a early position player who decides to put in a raise to $25. The action then falls to me in middle position, and I look down at King 10 of spades. So in this spot, given the position that I'm in, I think if we are going to play this hand, I would much rather continue with a 3-bet rather than a call. I think if we were on the button, I think this hand would then start to call at a higher frequency, given that there's less players behind to act and therefore less chances of us getting squeezed behind. So I decide to continue for a 3-bet to $75. The action then falls all the way to the small blind, who decides to cold call my 3-bet, and then continues folding back to the early position opener, who also decides to join the party with a call. We are now going 3 ways to the flop, which comes 8-9 jack with 2 spades. So we flop ourselves a flush draw to go along with our open-ended straight draw. So pretty sweet flop. The early position player decides to start with a check, and the action is now on me, especially that we've got one of the best draws that we could have in this spot. We were pretty comfortable to be putting in some more money here and even play for stacks. So in this spot, I decide to continue for a C bet of $110. Nash is now on the small blind who decides to go into the tank. And after a little while, he decides to make the call. Ash is now back on the early position player who now decides to look at his stack and he decides to cut out some chips. But these are not calling chips. He decides to put in a check raise to $325. When I see this raise, I'm immediately looking at Villain's stack to see how much he's got behind, and Villain's playing like $900 effective. Not that I'm ecstatically thrilled to see the raise here, but on the other hand, I don't see us ever folding here. Villain's showing a lot of strength here, and even though we are in position, if we do decide to continue for a call, he's pretty much going to be jamming all river cards here. So I think calling is pretty much the same as getting all the money in here, to be fair. So after going into the tank for quite a while here, given this much equity that we have, I think we just need to run the board here and run out our equities. So I decide to jam the rest of my stack in. I slide in all of my $100 chips in. The small blind then makes the fold, and the early position player, unsurprisingly, makes the snap call. So we are now off to see turn and river card here, and I'm hoping to hit one of my million outs here. And on the turn, the dealer puts out the offsuit 10. On the river, the dealer puts out an offsuit 6. I table my hand, and Villain shows ace jack of spades for a flop top pair and the nut flush draw, which is pretty much the worst case scenario that we could have ran into. That's the fan I was afraid of. Alright, so that concludes all the interesting hands that we played from our session last week. We played quite a lot of hands and paid a lot of rake. But we did eat a lot as well. At the end of the session, we managed to end up $656. As a summary for the week, interestingly enough, we managed to end the week up $656. Thanks for watching, guys. Next week's going to be my last week of poker, and where I'm going to wrap up my summary for my trip in Canada. So yeah, hopefully I will see you in the next video. Peace.